Hello, folks. This is Race Matters, and I'm the host, Eddie Carson. And like we do every episode, we lean into the nomenclature of exploring matters such as race, class, gender, culture, and all those elements that seem to divide us. But yet, through these deep conversations and with guests such as Professor Robert Greene that we have here today, we try to mend that color line and those differences too by adding a little bit more funk, a little bit more knowledge to those of you who are listening. You are listening here at JOP, right? Joppa Radio, 96.3, Newburyport, Massachusetts. And we're kind of bringing this framing here in different ways. You can find this episode at YouTube, on SoundCloud, at my website, professorcarson.com. As always, thank you, my friends, for chiming in. And like every episode, I'm always excited because I get to bring in folks who are just exponentially brilliant, who are doing wonderful scholarship and who are contributing to the conversations that we're having here. And my friends, those of you who are chiming in and listening, we have here Professor Dr. Robert Greene II from Claflin University. And so you know, Claflin University is the oldest, I believe it's the oldest HBCU in the state of South Carolina. And one of the things that Professor Greene has done is he's really launched some really deep methodical scholarship, particularly thinking about the plight of Black folks in different ways. Professor Greene received his BA degree in writing and linguistics with a concentration in creative writing from Georgia Southern University. He earned his MA degree in history from Georgia Southern, as well as a PhD from the University of South Carolina. Professor Greene has published a book chapter in the collection of Navigating the South. He has published a number of other scholarly articles, particularly things that are found in even popular magazines such as The Nation, Jacobin, The Dissent, Scallywag, Current Affairs, and much, much more. His research interests include African American history, American intellectual history since 1945, and really delving into exploring Southern culture as well. He's a blogger and a book review editor. You can find some of his work here in a sense at I believe it's the U.S. Intellectual. Am I correct there? Trying to hold on to that?
The Society of U.S. Intellectual Historians.
Society of U.S. Intellectual Historians. He is also the current president for the African American Intellectual History Society, which is just great work, and I'm excited to say that I've been a member of the AAIHS since our first annual conference at the University of North Carolina back in 2016. Brother, my friend, welcome to Race Matters. How you doing?
Oh, I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me on the show. And I think it's particularly great to be on a show that's in Massachusetts because, in case your listeners don't know, Claflin University is named after two folks from Massachusetts, Lee and William Claflin. So the school has a lot of links to Massachusetts and the broader New England area.
Oh, that's fascinating. I didn't know that. That's news to me as I continue to learn different things always. Since we're kind of delving in and exploring this and everything too, a couple questions I want to ask you as we get things started here. Could you share a little bit with us about who you are? Maybe a little bit about your upbringing, early experiences that shaped you, and particularly your interest in African American history, African American studies.
Well, definitely. I'm glad that you have me on the show. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm always happy to talk about what got me into history in the first place, because I think it's especially important for folks to understand that we as scholars are, contrary to popular belief, also human beings. And for me, it was actually my parents who really understood my love of history from a very, very young age. Um, some of my earliest memories involve loving two things, history and Star Trek. And growing up in Augusta, Georgia, um, you were often surrounded by Black history. We like to claim James Brown. The folks across the river in Aiken don't really appreciate that, but that's a separate conversation for a different time. But when I was growing up, my father especially understood that I love history. Whenever my parents took to the library, I would always get books of history, especially African American history. So my dad would often take me to a bookstore in Augusta called Hamilton's. It was a Black-owned bookstore Was around for many years, and it was the first place that I went to where, outside of my home, of course, that I encountered Black history, Black culture in such an intentional way. And also, my father had me watch Glory at a very young age. I think there's a generation of historians and scholars of the Black experience who were shaped by that film. That was released in 1989, right? About, again, the 54 Massachusetts. Always comes back to Massachusetts somehow. Um, but also, my grandmother, she gave me the set of the Ebony Pictorial History of Black America books that were first released in the early 70s. I would always look at those books when my parents took to my grandmother's house. And one day when I was 6 years old or so, she asked me, "Well, do you want to take them home with you?" And I thought, "Well, no, these are your books. I can't just take them." And she said, "No, you're the only person who ever looks at these books, so you need to go ahead and take them." And in fact, they're still right behind me on my bookshelf right now, over 30 years later. So I still have those books. But really, I think what heavily influenced me was growing up in a household where my parents really valued reading. I can recall every single day reading the newspaper. Every month, like every other good, outstanding Black family, we read Ebony magazine together. I can recall going to the barber shop and reading Jet magazine. And I will leave aside the Jet Beauty of the Week joke I want to make right now, but I'm not going to make that joke. But I think for those who are listening, who understand, you understand.
We get it.
But
Get it.
but otherwise, though, I think I had the experience most Black scholars my age and a bit older had of being in a household that valued reading, that valued scholarship, and that valued Black culture in the very myriad forms that it takes.
It's really exciting hearing about Jet Magazine and Ebony in my household. You're right. I can sit here, and one of the things I can tell you is we had them all stacked up, right? They came in on the coffee tables where you walked in different places and everything too. You talk about your fascination with books and your parents were as readers and embracing Black identity and Black history and Black culture. How old were you when you started your first library?
Oh goodness, I had to have been, I guess, maybe 7 or 8.
Oh, wow.
Well, in the sense that my parents certainly encouraged me when I had an allowance to get a book every now and then. But I can recall when I was 8 or 9 years old, getting home from school one day, and my parents had purchased for me this set of 12 young adult version of classic novels, and they were the ones that came with like pictures and everything in them. But right then and there, I understood, oh, this is the value of having a lot of books together in one place. And I added those to my collection with my Ebony Pictorial History of Black America and other books on Black history.
Do you still have a lot of those books today in your adult, your academic, your professional life?
So, that's a great question because I still have the Pictorial History of Black America books. I still have those. In fact, a funny story about them, I mentioned them in passing in class at Claflin several years ago. And my students asked me, "Oh, will you bring those for us to see?" And so I did. And they were genuinely amazed by the quality of the books themselves. I mean, because the books at this point are about 50 years old, now that I think about it. But the photographs, the paintings in the books were all mesmerizing. I have some of the older books still back at home at my parents' house in Augusta. But most of my library now is, as is the case with most scholars, everything from college and graduate school onward.
In hearing this and everything too, and thinking about your background, your undergraduate work was in creative writing.
Right,
That's
right.
there, right? And then of course, a lot of your work now is a little bit more, probably more academic work and everything too, right?
Mhm.
Any ambitions to really focus on that creative side, maybe works that kind of allude to that. It's hard to find time to do that kind of work when you've got to produce a lot of scholarly type stuff.
Whenever my friends who are creatives listen to this broadcast, their ears are going to start burning because they've been asking me the exact same question for quite a while now. Ironically enough, though, my foray into writing about history actually began via creative writing. When I was a freshman in college at Georgia Southern, I wrote a short story for our literary arts magazine called Miscellany, and it was a short story called Hellfighter. It was about the Harlem Hellfighters. And in the story, the entire story is about a man who's fighting in this regiment in the Great War in World War One. And the first half, or the first really two-thirds of the short story is about his experience fighting in France. But then the last third of the short story caught everyone off guard because it goes into him describing what it was like being lynched in the United States when he got home from the war. And so I was able at a young age, I was 18 when I wrote that, to really utilize fiction writing to talk about history. That's something I've wanted to go back to ever since then. A lot of my writing right now is academic writing or public facing writing. But most of my favorite comments I've received about my writing has always been, oh, this writing is crisp, clear. We can tell you have a creative writing background, but I do want to get back to fiction writing. Funny enough, my creative writing degree, my two areas of focus within the degree were actually fiction writing and creative nonfiction. And I think folks see a lot of both of those in what I write today. And I will admit that since starting my foray into history, I've had to kind of work my way back to my creative writing roots while still staying true to my scholarship as a historian.
I got to ask this question, and I've sat down and I've kind of mapped out what it would be like to write a fictional novel and what would it look like. Of course, me in many ways plagiarizing the styles of Ralph Ellison because my favorite book since high school has been Invisible Man. I believe it's the greatest fictional novel ever written, and folks can disagree. That's your opinion. I'm going to stick to mine here. But in doing so, because I don't have that kind of training that you have, I've always found it difficult to construct dialogue in writing.
Mm.
How have you dealt with that?
That's also a really difficult challenge for me because there is, I think, a fine line between dialogue that is realistic
Mm-hmm.
and dialogue that, especially for writing characters of color, especially writing black characters, dialogue that veers into stereotype.
Absolutely.
And I will say that when I was in college, that was something I had to deal with, not just from that angle, but also because of the fact that I was often the only black writer in the room. And so I'm having to think about, well, if I'm writing black characters, how will they be perceived by people who are both black or not black, right? And I think with dialogue, the dialogue should serve the purpose of showing who the character is. In the creative writing, there's the expression show, don't tell. And I think dialogue is the most important way of showing, not telling, what a character is like or who a character actually is. It's difficult, and I think this is where the editing process comes into play. Because if you take some time away from the page and then come back, you realize, well, this dialogue fits this character perfectly, or actually, this isn't something this person would say. Let's be true to the character as opposed to being afraid of what others might think about the character.
I remember, at a young age too, even going back to high school, wrestling through some of that by reading Toni Morrison's work, for example,
Mm-hmm.
where I remember really struggling to get through Porgy and Bess, and just the dialogue was so heavy in there and everything too, and trying to navigate through that. And it's always exciting to ask, someone such as yourself with that skill set, what would that look like, and what does that mean to you? Someone who is aspirational in terms of wanting to see that happen and everything too. Since we're on this topic and everything too, and thinking about you as an academic, you as a leading scholar here, what help us understand what thinkers, teachers, or community voices most inspired your academic journey? And how do you continue to influence? How do they continue to influence your scholarship today?
Mm-hmm.
Well, question, but I'm always excited to ask that question.
No, this is a great question, and I have to start with a story that I think some folks have heard before at conferences or have heard we talk about personally. But I would argue my greatest champion, the person I look up to the most in academia, or as just a black scholar in general, is of course W.E.B. Du Bois. And I know that that seems like almost a trite answer. It's like, well, of course say Du Bois, but let me explain why. Because I think each scholar has a different come to Du Bois moment, right? For me, it was in college. In college at Georgia Southern, I was fortunate enough to take a couple of courses on African American history. I took two courses on African American history, a course in African American literature. Up until that point, most of what I learned about Black history and Black literature, I did on my own, or through family members and the like. So these were the first classes I ever had in my life that were just about Black culture and Black life and Black history. And so one of my African American history courses was taught by a professor named Dr. Alfred Young. And he required us to do a book review for the class. And so he gave us a list of books to look at. And he said, let me know at the end of the week which book you wish to review. So by this point, I had already read Souls of Black Folk. I was already intrigued by Du Bois. I'm looking at the list of books, and I see a book I hadn't heard of before, Black Reconstruction America. And I said, "Oh, that sounds pretty fascinating. Let me choose that one." So I remember I wrote on like a sheet of paper, "This is the book I want to review." And I went to Dr. Young's office hours, and he said, "Mr. Greene." I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you sure you want to read Black Reconstruction America?" Now, mind you, I am in college. I think I was
Is this your first year in college?
no, thankfully not. I think I was at this point my first semester as a junior, I think.
Okay, I was gonna
Either
say that's quite a book to read your first
well,
year in college. I mean,
so
that's quite a book to read at any point.
well to that point, right? He looks at me and he says, "Okay, okay." He doesn't even try to warn me. He says, "Okay, he's like, okay, you'll see." So at the time, our library was going through renovations, and so some of the books that were in the library were off campus at a repository. You had to request them, and they would come and they would email you when they came to the front desk for pickup. So I get the email, it says Black Reconstruction is ready for pickup. I'm like, yes, okay, let me go to the library and get the book. Get to the front desk and say, oh, I'm here for this book. She says, oh, sure. She grabs the book. I see it, and I'm thinking to myself, oh, I just requested a brick to read. Okay. So I'm thinking about how my professor, Dr. Young, was a bit skeptical of me reading this book, and I realized why he was. But then I got home that night. I opened to the preface, and when I read Du Bois, and he's talking about how this book was not written for people who didn't think Black folks were human. He said, if you believe a Negro is a human being, this book is for you. Otherwise, you can just put it to the side. When I read that, I
Oh,
said to myself, oh, I didn't know historians could write like this. And I began reading it, and then I got to the propaganda of history chapter, and it made me view history in a very, very different way. Suddenly, everything crystallized. It was like being in the Matrix and realizing, oh, the Matrix is real, but also here's a way out of the Matrix.
mhm. Oh, and for folks who are viewing this on YouTube, right? I'm just kind of
Uh, I have that copy in my office right now.
copy. This one was introduced by David Levering Lewis and
Right.
everything too through his introduction. And I mean, that's impressive because one of the things I'll say is that Du Bois's Black Reconstruction helped me think about Du Bois like a lot of scholars in a different way. I had always been for a long time married to that younger, earlier Du Bois. I first read Souls of Black Folks when I was in high school, and then I kind of held on to this picture for a long period of time. Then I got to Black Reconstruction, explored it. But you know, the thing for me, my friend, about Black Reconstruction, it's still years and years and years after I first read it that I start to really fully start to grasp it. I'll
Hmm.
first admit, folks, when I read it, I missed a lot of things. And thanks to folks like you, Professor Greene, and I can point to other folks where I start to kind of really start to see that seep in and everything too. That is a fun story to hear.
Well, and I think to add to your earlier question, some of the other folks who've inspired me, my dissertation chair, Marjorie Sproul, she was really instrumental in making me see the connections between politics and race in modern America, in ways that, as we all know, are still affecting us right now in 2025. Lisa Denmark, my master's thesis advisor, she always reminded me to like have a good sense of humor about everything. Because I think one critique I have received from friends of mine and family over the years is that I can sometimes be a bit too serious about things, which might be a surprise to my friends now. But having a keen sense of understanding the challenges of the past and the present. I would say that right now, in terms of influences on me today, a good friend of mine, Catherine Silva, who's actually back in Massachusetts now, hopefully she's listening to this. She was a tremendous influence on me while she was department chair of humanities at Claflin. And Bobby Donaldson here in Columbia, South Carolina, he's at the University of South Carolina. He has been active in really making people aware of the rich civil rights history here in Columbia and throughout South Carolina. And finally, Majeska Simpkins. She was a longtime human rights champion here in South Carolina. I am currently the lead instructor for the Majeska Simpkins School of Human Rights. But Miss Simpkins was the kind of person who, when we talk about civil rights figures who should be better known, she should be at the top of that particular list. She was involved in every civil and human rights movement from really the 19 teens until she died in 1992. So those are just some of the figures who have influenced me over the years.
One of the things you pointed out earlier, and I appreciate you sharing that because we all have our mentors, whether are part of the present, part of the past. We kind of delve back into that. And you mentioned early on, right? Because, and I think we still got to go back and give them a shout out. The influence your parents had on you when it came to books and everything too, and guiding you in that direction. And that's a luxury, my friend, that not a lot of folks have. And so I just
Well,
give a shout out to them.
oh, absolutely. And I think also when talking about my parents and how they appreciate reading and reading very different things like reading books, reading magazines, reading newspapers, I do worry about the current generation of young people and how, on the one hand, no generation has had more access to more knowledge than this generation does. The issue is, on the other hand, what that knowledge looks like and how it's disseminated to them. And, reflecting on my own story as a historian, I really was lucky enough to come at the tail end of the age of black media, like black print media, right? Again, I mentioned Ebony and Jet magazine. We read, of course, our local newspaper, the Augusta Chronicle, but we also read other black publications in town as well. And then going to a black-owned bookstore. These are the kinds of things that I think are just now making a comeback, albeit more so in the online web space. But that's not quite the same thing as having physical copies of these things in your hands. And not only that, but having conversations with other folks about what you're reading. Again, my parents were understanding of the importance of not just reading, but also talking about what you read and talking about it with other people who were like-minded and as curious as you were.
You mentioned, and again, all folks start to sound like those folks who are looking back and waving their finger and judging. And I've had this conversation about my concern about how people engage with literature and reading. No indictment on my students or folks. Most of the time I see most folks kind of scrolling through TikTok, right, and
Right.
ascertaining a lot of information that way that doesn't do the trick and everything. How do you see your role as a teacher, particularly as an African American teacher, as a teacher who teaches courses in Black history, Black studies, especially at a HBCU? How do you see your role in shaping a future in terms of how we think about ideas, knowledge, maybe even your concerns for the future?
I began teaching at Claflin University in the fall of 2018. At the time, I was a visiting assistant professor. Since I've been assistant, now I'm associate with tenure. And during this entire time, I think every semester my teaching has taken on a greater sense of urgency. And that urgency is for a variety of reasons. Number one, you just mentioned I teach an HBCU. That is absolutely correct. But I think it also matters I teach at an HBCU in South Carolina. Because most of our students, when they get to my classes, they are often taking my courses, especially the African American or U.S. history survey courses. They're taking them for elective credit or general education credit, and then they'll just move on. But I can't tell you how many times I've had students who've told me after they finished my classes, Dr. Greene, if I learned history like this in K through 12, I would like history a lot more now. And the reason for that is when they get to my classes, they're not just learning about the big names in history, the facts and the dates. They're learning about, well, why did this happen? How did this happen? In particular, they are often stunned by how much they don't know. And I think this is the thing that we have to really focus on. You mentioned TikTok a moment ago. I think a lot of students, when they go on social media, they're often intrigued by posts that say, these are the things you weren't taught in
Yeah.
school. These are the things you didn't learn in school. And as a student, I always tell them, you should ask yourself why that was the case. I'll give you two quick examples. My first year at Claflin, I taught U.S. history to 1865. And that's a course that, on the one hand, I enjoyed teaching, but on the other hand, I kind of hate it because since it's to 1865, you can start theoretically whenever you want.
Right.
So I start with explaining the world before Columbus's voyage across the ocean. Then I get to Christopher Columbus. And I tell my students, by the way, what do you know about Christopher Columbus? And they all said the same thing. 1492, he had three ships, he ended up into the Santa Maria. He quote unquote discovered America. Although I will say my students now that I'm getting in school, they don't even say that about discovering America. They're at least aware that he found an island, not the
Okay,
Americas
that's
itself.
progress. Progress.
That's progress, right? And also they don't hear as much about the whole flat Earth thing, which is also progress. So then I said to them, well, what if I told you he made four voyages? They were like, what? And I said, well, what if I told you at one point he was governor of Hispaniola and his rule was so brutal and sadistic, he was arrested by the Spanish authorities? And they looked at me like I was suddenly speaking Klingon. Like they could not believe what I was saying. And by the end of it, one of my students, I never forget, she said, I'm outraged. I can't believe I'm just learning this now. Which takes me to my second story, is whenever I taught the students about things like Denmark VC's conspiracy in Charleston or the Stoner Rebellion of 1739, again, the vast majority of our students are from South Carolina. They go to school here not learning about either of those events, or if they do, it's touched on briefly and then they move on. And so I think the students often appreciate the fact that I take time to talk about Black history in South Carolina. Oftentimes, when I talk Black history, it's about everyone from everywhere else. But they're not taught about the rich history of life in South Carolina. We've got the Gullah Geechee community here. We've got Majeska Simpkins, Septima Clark, Robert Smalls, so on and so forth. And yet, that homegrown Black experience is not thoroughly discussed enough in K through 12. So when they get to Claflin, I'm saying, okay, you're at the oldest HBCU in this state. It is my responsibility to teach you these things before you leave this place.
It's interesting because there's another dynamic that's going to add to a challenging point there, and I love that you mentioned Denmark Vesey. I none of my students, most folks, they have no idea who Denmark Vesey, who he was. Then you start telling them the story about how things were orchestrated by white supremacists in South Carolina at the time to kind of create this sense of a rebellion that's going to
Right.
happen, the slave rebellion, and how through the archives and how really how historians discover the truth and everything. But one of the challenges we're facing, though, is the fact that we're starting to see greater restrictions on teaching, on instruction, right? Attacks on the Smithsonian. People don't want to call the KKK terrorists or Black knowledge, this whole erasure that's happening too. That is a huge concern as my identity, your identity, our memory of the past and how it impacts our present is being challenged. Have you pondered the challenges you're going to start experiencing moving forward as students are going to walk through your doors with even less knowledge than what we're talking about before, and the fact that there may be folks who are starting to even construct how you can really shape and tell them what that actual knowledge looks like, particularly when it comes to Black folks?
I will say one of the joys of working at a private HBCU is that I don't, at least for the moment, have to worry about some of the concerns my colleagues at, say, USC have to worry about or other
Yes.
public universities here. Um, with that said, I think working at Claflin also means that you have to embrace a particular mission as a Black scholar, that you know that what you're doing here does make a difference. And to your point, I've given that a lot of thought over the last couple of years in particular. Again, I mentioned my work with the Majeska Simpkins School. That is essentially a freedom school. I've been doing it since 2019. And there, I'm able to teach folks who are a high school age, college age, people who are old as 60 or 70 years old. And they'll tell me the same things I heard from my students in Claflin. I didn't learn this before. Why am I just hearing this now? So on and so forth. I've also had the pleasure of at times giving talks at local Black churches, at local Black run organizations, and so forth. What I'm getting at here is that we don't have to really reinvent the wheel. to save Black history. What we're going to have to do, however, is get back to basics, and the basics are we're going to have to lean on our institutions that we've already created. The problem here is that many of our institutions have been degraded over the last 30 to 40 years. They've lost support, they've lost funding, they've lost membership. We're going to have to find ways to foster genuine community once again. And in those spaces, whether it be Black churches, Black run civic organizations, even just Black book clubs or, Black social groups and the like, we're going to have to utilize those to really teach and talk about Black history because I think you're right. There is a retreat from not just Black history, but just holistic history in general in public K through 12 education. We're going to have to provide support spaces for folks to learn about these things while we try to hold the line, so to speak, and try to fight to make sure that what history is left in the school system can stay there and we can kind of use that to branch out and hopefully push back against some of this resistance.
My friend, I mean, absolutely outstanding. And folks, for you who are just chiming in, you're listening to Race Matters. I'm Eddie Carson, and I am here with Professor Robert Greene. And we're kind of delving into really exploring his background and some of the challenges that we're seeing when it comes to education, higher education, and some of those things that are unfolding. You know what? And since we're talking about HBCUs, you know, it would be criminal of me not to ask you about maybe your concerns when probably like myself, you're getting breaking news about Black colleges, HBCUs, a plethora of them having to cancel classes, threats, concerns that are happening there too. What kind of percolated through your mind, and what was the experience like on your campus when all of this breaking news was transpiring? And did y'all have to deal with any of this?
Well, so that's a really interesting question because we dealt with it that evening. We had an email go out from the administration the night of when these five HBCUs announced they were getting threats and such, had to close down for the day or for the weekend. And the announcement broke my heart because it told students, hey, look, we have counseling services for you. Public safety is on the watch 24/7. And you think to yourself, these students who are going to school, many of them are away from home for the first time in their lives. This is not something they should have to deal with. And yet, like you just said, this is part of the larger history of HBCUs, that oftentimes HBCUs have operated as citadels of Black life in places that were very hostile to Black life. In fact, most of your listeners, most of us have forgotten that it was just 2 or 3 years ago where there were bomb threats called into HBCUs all across the country, including Claflin. And I remember this because I wrote a piece for the Nation magazine about these bomb threats and about how they fit into the larger history of violence directed towards HBCUs and Black institutions in general. And the irony of that was the day I finished the piece about HBCU violence was the day Claflin received the bomb threat. And I've heard the stories from people who worked at Claflin at the time who heard the bomb threat over the phone and how terrifying it was. Our students, unfortunately, between experiencing that, coming of age during the age of George Floyd and Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin, our students have a unique relationship with not just white supremacy, but also Black death on a public scale that I think unfortunately relates more to generations that dealt with lynchings, for example, or anything else. It's actually astonishing to think about how much they have to deal with in terms of seeing violence on the internet towards Black people, whether it be physical or verbal or the like. But you're absolutely right. HBCUs, we are a family. And when those HBCUs received those threats, all of us collectively felt a shiver down our spines. The hope is that nothing else like this happens, but HBCUs are well aware of the fact that we do our best to protect our students, but we have often been the targets of wanton violence and destruction.
I appreciate that response. And, knowing that we were going to have this conversation, my friend, and this event happened, you popped up, you were on my mind. And I was wondering, how are things happening on your campus? How are y'all navigating this? what's floating through the thoughts of your students as these things are happening too. You know, and again, sticking with HBCUs just for a second, and thinking about some of the current challenges and everything too. What is your hope for the future for HBCUs and your concerns regarding HBCUs?
Well, I think again, working at Claflin, working in Orangeburg, South Carolina, it informs a lot of what I'm about to say. And I want to start by going back to your previous question because we in SC State, the school right next to us, we have a unique relationship with HBCU history. SC State is likely known to most people as the site of the Orangeburg Massacre of 1968, where two college students and a high school student were shot and killed by South Carolina troopers. Um, and so we have a unique relationship, both Claflin and SC State, with thinking through what HBCUs can and should be. Again, for a long time, Claflin in particular was a place where if you were a black person in South Carolina, you went to get a quality liberal arts education from a place like Claflin. Claflin had the first art department of any university in South Carolina, even before USC or College of Charleston or Clemson, any of the other universities. For many years, we emphasized our liberal arts heritage in art, music, history, philosophy, English, theater, dance, etc. I think now with HBCUs, while many of our universities always emphasize job training, we emphasize getting something on your return for getting a degree in higher education. I think some of my colleagues would argue that Booker T. Washington in some ways won, right, when it comes to talking about what HBCU should be doing in terms of industrial education versus liberal arts education. What I think we have to do with HBCUs is we have to uphold the liberal arts humanities side of things too. Because so many of our problems today as a society can be linked back to the fact that as a society, as Americans, most of us tend to downplay the importance of liberal arts, whether it be history, whether it be literature, or fine arts, or philosophy. Just thinking through what it means to not just be an American or a citizen, but thinking through what it means to be a human being.
Mm.
I think the era that we live in can be characterized by the fact that many folks in positions of power and authority, whether in politics or in business, have quite frankly forgotten to think through those questions. They think of people as just statistics or as numbers, not as actual flesh and blood human beings who are worthy of respect, dignity, and empathy. I think it's those values and qualities that HBCUs have to hold on to because there's a saying that when it comes to oppression and human rights violations and the like, black people are the canaries in the coal mine.
Mm.
I think that's the same is true for education. If black run institutions can hold on to the humanities and liberal arts and hold on to teaching what it means to be human, then that gives us, as a full-fledged society, some real hope. But if even HBCUs drop the ball on that, if we focus only on job training, we focus only on quote unquote getting a job, which by the way is a mistake because the job market now is so unstable, your training should be really be in how to be flexible with your education and learn from multiple points of view. But if we drop the ball on that and we forget what our mission has been to not just educate black folk, but to remind them what it means to be citizens and human beings in a hostile place, if we forget that mission, then we are in trouble as a people, both as black people and more broadly speaking, as American people.
So, Robert, I got to ask you, thinking about your research and some of the stuff you've done, and I believe it's your working book, your working manuscript, as
Yes.
you're really exploring the relationship between African Americans and the Democratic Party. I want to say that window, remind me, is it 1964 to 94?
1964 to 2000.
Okay, 1964 to 2000. Tell us a little bit about your book and help us understand, what's really misunderstood about the relationship between the Democratic Party and Black people in this country.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, right now the current title, tentative title is The Newest South, African Americans and Democratic Party, 1964 to 2000. And the book is based off of my dissertation work and research. And really, I think I went into the project knowing that most folks assume,
Mhm.
somewhat rightly, that black voters overwhelmingly support the Democratic Party. So we already know that. My question has been, well, how strong is that support and how important has that support been? And on the flip side, how have Democrats tried to hold on to that support since the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964? That's why I start with that particular year. Most scholars will tell you that black voters really migrating towards the Democratic Party begins in the 1930s during the New Deal era. But it's also worth noting that during the 50s, when Dwight D. Eisenhower was president and ran for president twice as a Republican, you have President Eisenhower getting upwards of 40% of the black vote, both 52 and 56. Part of that was that he was a war hero. Part of it was that the Democratic Party in the 50s had kind of lost some of its luster among civil rights activists because of lack of action under Presidents Roosevelt and Truman, who had a lot of great rhetoric on civil rights, especially Truman, but had a difficult time getting anything through Congress regarding civil rights legislation. But I started in 64 because that's really when you start to see the black vote just firmly stay with the Democratic Party. In 1960, of course, many would argue that Republicans and Democrats alike had a chance at the black vote. Um, However, then Vice President Richard Nixon did not make the phone call that John and Robert Kennedy made to get Martin Luther King out of jail in Georgia to reassure Coretta Scott King just before Election Day. And so Jackie Robinson, who was a prominent Republican supporter at the time, even said that this was Nixon's biggest mistake, not making that one phone call, at least show support with the King family. In 64, of course, you have Lyndon Johnson running on a record of civil rights reform versus Barry Goldwater, who distinctively did not vote for the Civil Rights Act. But you know, Goldwater is an interesting figure in all this because he was a conservative Republican, but he was also a libertarian. And in Arizona, he actually had a reputation for being a stalwart civil rights champion. But in 64, he felt A, the CRA went too far, and in terms of growing the power of the federal government, and B, he was one of the first Republicans to say, actually, our real voter base of conservatives is in the South. It's amongst white Southerners. We need to go after them, go where the ducks are, as he put it. And so in 1964, look at a map. What does Goldwater win? Just five paltry Southern states and his own state of Arizona. He gets blown out. But it sets the stage for the Republican Party becoming the conservative party we know today, and also shedding its liberal wing, because for a long time it had folks like Nelson Rockefeller, Jacob Javits, so on and so forth. But I want to look at the Democratic Party because, especially in recent years, there's been a lot of discussion of Democrats taking the black vote for granted.
Mhm.
And I've always wondered, well, this is likely not a new argument or a new question. What has this looked like? And my argument is very simple, that the Democrats who've run for national office who got the biggest and broadest support from black voters from 64 through 2000 tended to be Southerners. Lyndon Johnson from Texas, and then Jimmy Carter from Georgia, and Bill Clinton from Arkansas, because all three of them, especially Carter and Clinton, understood that black voters were an integral part of their base. The question becomes, how do you attract significant black support, especially in election years that are going to be very close, like, for example, 1976?
Right.
Where Jimmy Carter narrowly defeats Gerald Ford. Now, in 76, Carter has the advantage of Martin Luther King Sr. campaigning alongside him. So it's like you got Dr. King's daddy campaigning aside Jimmy Carter. That's going to help you get some black voters. But Carter was also pretty strong on civil rights. He gave a pro civil rights speech during his inauguration as governor of Georgia. He put prominent blacks in positions of authority in the federal government in the late 70s. He also strongly defended black voting rights. But when you got to 1980, and this is also what my book argues, you can't just talk about civil rights with black voters. You also have to focus on other bread and butter issues. I don't want to say that civil rights and economic rights are separate. They're often linked together intricately. But if you don't focus on both, black voters will also lose support for you. So, for example, in 1980, Carter still wins the black vote, but black voters are not turning out from like they did in 1976, in part because they're being hit the hardest by the late 1970s economic downturn. And so they're asking, yeah, we like Jimmy Carter personally. We don't really like Ronald Reagan,
Mhm.
but it's not enough to scare us with Reagan. It's not enough to scare us with right wing conservatism. Democrats, you have to offer us a vision. And that question is, what does that vision look like? What does that offer to black voters in the last now really 60 years or so? These are questions Democrats still wrestle with because in the last few election cycles, with Hillary Clinton in particular in 2016, there was that question of, well, what are you actually offering black voters beyond Donald Trump is bad?
Right.
I think in 2024 is a bit different with Kamala Harris because she was offering some plans, but I think people have just become so cynical about politics now that it's hard for them to take anything seriously from leading candidates for the highest office in the land.
It's fascinating when we think about this too, because we think back to the 80s and, there's naturally that assumption that, oh, Ronald Reagan, if you're black, right, there's no way we want anything to do with him. But yet we start to see in the 1980s, though there was the economic downturn in the economy and everything too, that there's still that burgeoning black middle class and folks thinking about their wallets and their pocketbooks and really moving beyond the color line in different ways, starting to see maybe you kind of the changing of the guard in some ways when we think about folks from that civil rights era who are looking in different ways because that educational aspect, right, especially that middle class element really starts to come to fruition. And I'm glad you mentioned even Kamala Harris, and and in thinking about that, excuse me, Kamala Harris, and thinking about the element that she lost black voters, and Kamala lost these black voters. A lot of questions too. Is it because she's not giving us enough stuff, which a lot of folks thought she did? Or is it the fact that she's a woman of color, right? And we get into kind of some of that the male hierarchical stuff that's there too. Your book really, I'm excited. I look forward in terms of it coming out and kind of delving in and really looking to explore some aspects of it too. I know your timeline you cut off around 2000. I grew up in an age when I was, coming out of junior high school and high school, and Bill Clinton was emerging, and black folks were like, "Oh, we're going to finally get a black man in a White House being Bill Clinton." And of course, right, we know that's not the case, and we know that's problematic. But yet, I did grow up at a time where we were saying that because the idea of ever having a black man in a White House just seemed unconscionable. And the fact that this brother might be the first one with his saxophone and kicking it with Arsenio Hall and his barbecue and talking the language and kicking it with black folks down south, when we know that Bill Clinton, besides being in office and at the law school at the University of Arkansas, wasn't that much of a Southerner. Now, he kind of moved on in many ways, but feel free to correct me, my friend.
Well, I think so to borrow a phrase from the film Malcolm X, when he said that brother's starving, I think that was a reflection of how black voters were starving for something in the early 1990s. And Clinton is actually a really interesting figure in all this because I juxtapose him with someone who I think I don't want to say is forgotten now. He's not forgotten, but I think his importance has been downplayed, and that's Jesse Jackson. Jackson runs for president twice in the 80s, 84 and 88. In the 88, especially, he has like a chance to win. Like at one point, he's leading in delegates overall. He's winning some important states in the Democratic primary system. And Jackson, he offered a vision of the Democratic Party that in some ways spoke to what Barack Obama offered 20 years later in 2008. This idea, what Jackson called the Rainbow Coalition, what we later called the Obama Coalition, of stitching together voters from different ethnic and racial backgrounds. But Jackson in the 80s was very intentional about talking about economic rights too. He was very much trying to resuscitate the New Deal and Great Society ideal, but for a 1980s audience. So he's talking about a robust welfare state. He's talking about foreign affairs in a very nuanced way that we don't really relate with Jackson, right? But at the time, the 80s, he's talking about Palestine. He's talking about cutting defense spending. He's talking about reprioritizing things at home for the average American. Things that I think would still be radical within the Democratic Party even in 2025. But I think with Clinton, the thing about him is that he was able to use this image of his southernness to speak to black voters in a way that other Democrats weren't as comfortable doing. Now, I think today we have a lot more nuance about this. You were just talking about how he was referred to as the first black president. I think it's worth noting that when he was called at the time, it wasn't because of positive attributes of his, it was more so
Right.
because of these negative attributes. But I think also it points to how in the 80s and 90s, there was a real disconnect between, on the one hand, the mainstream of the Democratic Party, The centrists, the moderates of the Democratic Leadership Council, the DLC, of which Clinton was at one point a member, versus that progressive tradition within the Democratic Party that goes back to the Great Society, the New Deal, the Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Rights Movement, and so forth, that was really struggling against the idea that liberalism had died. Right? They were trying to remind folks that the Democratic Party, in fact, should embrace its liberal wing. And again, one of the reasons I'm writing this book is that I think the Democratic Party has historically struggled with that. And even now, 2025, I think one of the reasons they've struggled to have a response to the second Trump administration is that they really don't know what they are as a party beyond we aren't Donald Trump. My argument is you can't just run on what you aren't, you have to run on what you actually are.
It's fascinating. A number of months ago, I had Cornel West on this
Mm.
episode, and he said something very, very similar, particularly wrestling with the lack there of a message in leadership, the void, particularly for Black folks, and where does that leadership come from? If you're chiming in, folks, you're listening to Race Matters, Joppa Radio 96.3. I'm here with Professor Robert Greene. And as we start to bring this episode to a close here, my friend, Robert, like I like to do with all my guests, I love for my guests to have the last word, my friend. And it can be on anything you want to mention, anything you want to say for folks to kind of hear your prophetic voice in that particular way. Professor Greene, you have the last word here on Race Matters.
All I will simply say is that I hope your listeners, whether in Massachusetts or elsewhere, understand that folks in South Carolina are a lot more than just a red state on the map every 2 to 4 years. There are a lot of folks here in South Carolina who are committed to democracy, who are committed to human rights, civil rights. Many of them are Black, some of them are white. But we have a rich tradition of radicalism here in this state. Me and Tyler D. Perry co-edited a book called Invisible No More, The African American Experience at the University of South Carolina. And even in that book, we talk about how there is a Black history of this state that most folks, even in South Carolina, are not really aware of. For example, USC was the first integrated university in the South in 1873, well before the Civil Rights Movement. Claflin against been around since 1869. We have had a rich tradition of Black radicalism, of Black movement building, of Black radical traditions being here in South Carolina. And I hope that folks across the country recognize the fact that people in the South are trying to fight the good fight as well. And part of that good fight is saving our history, reflecting on our history, and teaching that history to folks in our nation and all over the world.
Folks, you're listening to Race Matters. Thank you for chiming in. Professor Robert Greene II here. Be well.